Hey, this is another YouTube video about Darktable. The last video I did was about how to take a whole bunch of files and quickly try to move them from like hundreds to the 10, 15 best unprocessed. This is a little bit more in depth. I'm going to process at least one of these files that was from a studio shoot and show you what my general workflow is with that. First thing, as often as I remember, I take a shot like this with this little color card. Who's it by? Color Checker by X-Rite, which is awesome. So if we open this, now notice that we got a little bit dim there. I'm going to talk about that in a second because I don't use base curves. But I'm going to go into white balance here. And I think there's a way that you can load this entire white balance card in, but I don't. Basically what I do is that is grayscale, whatever the 18% gray. Then each of these boxes is a little bit more towards sun and a little bit more towards shade, I guess. But I pretty much always go in the central one, which is just a kind of warm skin tone, slight sunshine grayscale. So we now have that captured for the set. What I do is I go back, I copy the white balance of that, and I paste that to all of the other images that were taken in that same set, so that they now have exactly the same white balance. And I love that. That's just saves so much time and so much, I mean, after working on so much, sound like Trump, not finishing my sentences, takes so much hugely time-saving stuff and things. But notice again, this has gone dim. So let's go into that. Let's look at what my default stack is. I'm going to work this image. I'm going to work it all the way through to a 10 by 8 because in the portfolio world, 10 by 8 is still really important crop. But I'm going to do the 10 by 8 crop actually in GIMP, because if I had shot this in a way that I could cut out 10 by 8, I would have a whole lot of wasted pixels. So I pretty much shoot this kind of frame. So look at my stack here. This is my default stack. I've added the white balance with that process that we've just done. It says there's a base curve because I don't know that you can actually turn base curve off, but let's look at I'll show you the base curve. The base curve I'm applying is I'm auto applying one that I have saved that is called flat. So it's just 0 curve. Because if you look at what Darktable wants that to be auto applied. Nikon like alternative I find slightly better for studio lighting, but again, I keep doing. If I use these defaults, I end up using the other things available to me like tone curve and levels and exposure, and coming back and finding that what I don't like is an attribute of where the base curve is. So I start with a completely flat base curve. Notice that I also have local contrast switched on by default. But if you look at my local contrast, this is at 0. So I have saved a zeroed preset for local contrast and said to apply that to every single image, because by the normal default, if you switch on local contrast, it's at 0.2, about there, which is often good, but I really like with an image to just creep up with the local contrast or down with the local contrast. So I really like to start at 0. So that's why I have this switched on by default. So here we have an image, and after the base curve is removed, clearly it needs some brightness. So there's one of two ways I go here. If I think this image is actually underexposed in the camera, then I use the exposure to correct that. And quite often I'll use that exposure to correct that as opposed to a curve. But in a situation like this where I believe it was well exposed in the camera, I'm much more likely to do either an S-curve. I click on, I go up with on the skin tone. It's kind of my central mark on the high side. And then just a tiny bit of contrast addition with that. And that's kind of where I go to a place where I really like the vibe. I really like the background and foreground contrast. At that point, I'm likely to raise the darks in the exposure module because I find it gives me just better control. But this is really what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a tiny bit of overexposed white in the face. And I'm looking for a tiny little bit of under black on the face. And if this was, let's see, if this was badly exposed, I pretty much never use the, here's what I generally do. If this was side lit and I thought, crap, I'm losing, I've a lot of shadows that I didn't really want on one side of the face, then what I tend to do with the tone curve is drag it from the bottom to the left. And that tends to flatten out highlights and lowlights. If I have a real crazy hot spot on the skin, I'm going to demonstrate that because it's an interesting one. I saw it in another YouTube video. So I'm going to overexpose here. So say I found this, I want everything else the way it is right now, but this overexposure is a problem. I use exposure to compensate for that by, I take this new instance, use a parametric mask, and I slide the input up until it's just pretty much selecting that problem area that I'm trying to fix. Add a little bit of blur to that mask, just a little. Then I take off the visual indicator and that indicator, and I go down visually here. I drop the exposure of just that selected area visually to the point that it starts to, you can see the brown coming in there. So visually to the point that it starts to look burnt. That's what I do if I've overexposed a touch somewhere. I do that rather than the shadows and highlights module, which I don't really use very often unless I'm using it for some kind of creative control, like really dropping the shadows. So let's delete that again. But that's a useful tool. That's really kind of the only time I use parametric masks. I should probably get to know them much better because they are pretty damn powerful. But going back to where we were with this, let's do the whole thing again. For the look of this, I'm pretty much thinking I'm going to drag up on the point where the skin tone has activated this chart, S-curve it a little bit, and I kind of like that as a basis. Okay, and then like I said, I will, yeah, that's all looking good. So yeah, quite often, not so much with outdoor, but quite often with studio work, I'll use the tone curve and just touch the blacks here, just a tiny bit. And that's pretty much my exposure. And then I let this go. I'm not really interested in this unless some visual cue shows something terrible is happening. So at this point, I have, as long as the image is pretty well exposed in the studio, I'm going to add in some local contrast, which is effectively our version of clarity. I'm going to do that very visually. About there, so 0.28. Or for sometimes for effect, I'll take that down. It's almost a softener bloom tool if you go the other way. It's an equally interesting effect, but for here we're going to go up to that, about 2.8. Why does that look more than it was the last time? 2.7. Interesting. It's funny how you can do exactly the same thing twice and want two completely different results. I will often do 1 or 2 clicks on the contrast. Definitely bring up saturation just a tad. If I'm really not liking skin tone, I will switch on Velvia in its default mode, but in this case I don't really need it. I'll definitely sharpen. I like that. What else? Once in a while vibrance, although I really don't see it making much difference most of the time. Sometimes I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, or 2 on this tint scale. If it's just looking a little bit green, then like it's a matter of 1 or 2 max 3. And I'm going to take that down to there because that just looks a little bit better. Oops. What am I doing? I don't want to leave yet. And in a studio shot, what's it called? It's called split color, split tone, split toning. Split toning is very popular. And in Darktable, the way I really like to do that is just sliding this shadow mark around. So all it's doing is changing the shadow tint. It's super powerful. There's a more powerful module to do the same thing. Colors, channel mixer. I think there's something else as well. But Darktable, you can do everything 3 or 4 ways. It's the same with the exposure. I took an image and I used base curve, tone curve, levels, exposure, and I played with the same image over and over and over again with the different ways. And eventually that helped me come down to the point that if it's a well exposed shot, especially studio, the tone curve is what I'm going to use predominantly to get to the ballpark of where I want the image to be. And I'll add in some blacks in the exposure module. If it's badly exposed, if it's underexposed and you do that, the colors start to go really weird. So if it's underexposed like that, what I'm more likely to use is use the exposure module to increase exposure, and then I'll use the tone curve potentially to bring up shadows. And levels gave a fairly similar result, I found, to exposure, although the center bar can do funky things. I usually use this if I'm trying to get some specific effect too. But if it's well exposed in the camera, there's very, very little that I do in Darktable at this point. It's that's possibly it, although depending on how much Photoshop some skin needs, I do use the equalizer. I've got a curve of my own that I've created, which is a combination of kind of bloom and denoise. And in some scenarios, if it's a close-up face, that can be kind of magical. In this case, with a further away face, it's just kind of blurring it. So it's not appropriate there. Let's turn that off. But that's as little work as I will often do on a well-exposed studio shot. And then probably if I have a bunch of similar shots from the same set, I'll probably paste. This doesn't have a crop, so I can just paste everything. And there we have two photos that are pretty good. So this took no time at all, because this took some time. I'm gonna do a crop on this. I like cropping 5:7. I really like a 5:7 crop for a full height portrait, but the world is still very 8:10 centric, so, but still, that's the right crop for that in my mind. But we're gonna take it into GIMP. And then the other one, I'm gonna do a crop. I can do an 8:10 on that. Just there. Yeah. Okay, so I'm super happy with those from a Darktable perspective. I'm now going to export them. And my settings are, I have a print and a web setting here. My print setting is JPEG, 100% quality. And I put it in the current folder in an exported directory with printable and the file name. So I'm going to export those. Where is my folder? So now I've ended up with this exported directory. I got my two images. Just for fun, let's open this with Portrait Pro. So I'm under Ubuntu here, but Portrait Pro actually works pretty well under Ubuntu and Wine. Drag everything where you can see it. Oops. So it's found the face. No, nice thing about shooting somebody like this model person is there's no need for Portrait Pro whatsoever. But if this was somebody who needed more touch-up, Portrait Pro, I don't like their presets. Like, their presets are kind of crazy. But there's a lot you can do with it. Even so, if you're a Linux Ubuntu user and you're watching this because this is what you use for use Darktable, then it is really worth having a look at this, because let's say we did. I often start with just skin, eyes, teeth. So that is just a slight. I'll pretend she actually needed touch up, but she absolutely doesn't. You can turn things off and on. Let's leave those freckles. You can do skin lighting control, which is pretty darn powerful. But again, this is a well-lit photo, don't need that. You can apply makeup, which is crazy. Crazy. You can do all kinds of crazy things. So it's a useful tool to have. But this is a bad example of an image to use it with, because there is no need. Although the eye control, let's turn that makeup off because it's stupid. But I do use this. Say I have a shoot and I want to somebody wants to look better or younger, then I'll build something for their face, and then I'll save it as a preset and just come in and crush it. But even for something like this, eye control is pretty good. So I could sharpen the eyes. I could brighten the iris, which is all good actually. I mean, even in this shot, that could be a value. You know what? I totally missed a step that I do when I export it. Let's get out of here. So I totally missed a step. Discard. I'm gonna delete those 2 images that were exported because I always do some kind of denoise, and I have that stored as a style. When I went into an image, I added bilateral denoise, then I came out and I created a style and just selected the denoise. So I'm going to denoise both of those, and then I'm going to export them. And you know what, just for fun, put my logo in there too. I do that as a style. So now it has added my watermark. I'm not a big watermark guy. I use it for very specific reasons. Not because I think people's going to steal my stuff. So I'm going to export those again. "20 minutes into this video. This file's going to be huge." Okay, so I'm going to take this one and open with GIMP. And what am I going to do in GIMP? Well, I'm going to see, is there anything in the floor that needs to be cleaned up? Well, there's definitely that flash. So clone tool. I'm doing stuff like this on the same layer. I don't really care. It's a pretty big brush, so that the size of that feather on the edge is pretty big. So that I can just sneak up on that line. All good. Now, so I wanted to do this 10 by 8. So I can do that. I don't think I'm going to do any. I just will, because we're here. The healing brush is such a powerful tool, even for flyaway hairs like that. Click. There's really no healing to be done here. Maybe. I mean, that's the nice thing about getting the lighting right and getting prep right and getting somebody's great skin. It's much easier. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to change my canvas size. I want this to be 8 by 10. So I believe on that width, the 8 by 10 equivalent is 11.616, because often with it, I often end up with exactly that. I could have moved this side by side. I'm going to press M, move that over to about, I'm going to move it over to, I'm going to have her off center in that 10 by 8. Then layer, I don't even need to do this, but layer to image size. So I've got this on the left and this on the right. What I'm finding is the absolute easiest way to do this is select a rectangle, Control C, Control V, make it a new layer, Shift T for scale. And there we go. Select the original layer again. Get as big a rectangle as I can, Control C, V. To new layer, Shift T for scale, and stretch. And that's pretty much our finished image. Although it's too far to the left. It's fine now. It's too far to the left, let's fix it. M for move. Click the layer I want, put it there. Click that one. Oops. Move that the same amount. Move that same amount. Rescale that to the edge. Better. Although I went low, didn't I? What did I do? Anyway, you get the idea. I'm not going to spend all day on this. Somehow I scaled down as well. So that's my kind of combo. That's my workflow, and then I overwrite the original file, Control S to save that file, and I end up with my working directory of exported. I have the GIMP file, I have the original file, and usually right at the end I'll go through and move all of the images that I'm just ready to deliver. I'll move them straight into finals. And then just for fun, go to export to finals, web resize, which is another script I have. That is resizing that as a 2500 wide on its maximum size. So if you're a Ubuntu user and you want to have a look at the scripts that I use for general workflow, like tethering. Let's see, is my camera? This could be a fail because Shotwell tries very hard to grab my camera, but let's see. I've written the script. Come on, fight and win. I think something is grabbing the camera. I don't usually tether from this machine, so excuse the fail. There we go. So I start this script in the directory that I want to tether in, and it just does a quick pass through. First one's always slow, second ones are a little bit faster. And in the background, I bet I have, yep, I'm using Eye of Gnome to display these on the fly. That's horrible white balance, yeah. So let me know if you want me to do a YouTube on that. All the scripts I use to just keep my Ubuntu system up and running, tethering remotely, tethering from a laptop that actually dumps onto this desktop. All those scripts, because I don't really like tethering with Darktable. It feels like I'm in a bit of a black box. I don't like tethering with Entangle because I don't understand why it always makes the file name capture something or some standard, because I'm capturing, like, I don't want to start at 0. The camera's doing a very good job of making unique file names across all of my stuff. Why would I start at 1 every time? I'll also do a video one of these days on, if you look at my ceiling here, let me know if you want a video on this. So I have, these are Rubbermaid shelves, and then across here I have rails I've added 2, and there's a Rubbermaid shelf across there. And then, this is very convenient. Hold on, I'm a little bit close to this. Oh, that's on its side. Hang on. Then I've used that white board. I've created these white boards from Home Depot. They're 12 bucks each. Put a rail across the top, put hooks on them. So these can go behind, to the side, diagonally. It's kind of a moving white wall system. I very often use them as a single flash, as a reflector on one side of a single flash. Works really well. Anyway, that video got a little bit off track. We were talking about Darktable. In summary, Darktable's awesome. There are 5 ways to do every single thing. Experiment, see what works for you in terms of which modules you like. Personally, I use the exposure module to fix bad exposure. I use the tone curve to dial in really where I like lighting to be. I don't use the base curve. Although I know it processes slightly differently. I think it's applied much earlier on in the stack. I try really hard to remember to take shots like this because it makes it super easy to do white balance throughout. I use this copy paste of the history stack a lot so that I'm working on one image that I think is typical of the set, then applying all of the changes I made apart from crop to all of the images, and then whistling through and doing small fixes. If it's a well exposed image, I'm pretty much exposure, local contrast, which is clarity, a little bit of contrast, a little bit of saturation, sharpening, sometimes color correction if I want to do an effect like this where I'm just going other than the black and white, the black background, I'm bringing some kind of a color in there. And then I denoise and I export and I'm good to go. Hope that helps. Have a good one.